From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. The Supreme Court's spring term has just come to an end, leading to a slew of big judgments being announced. But when one of the cases was first being heard back in April, there was an unexpected guest.
And I'm going.
You're going to go to the Supreme Court
I think
tomorrow?
so. I do believe.
And just sit there and listen.
Because I have listened to this argument for so long.
And go he did.
President Trump is heading to the U.S. Supreme Court this morning for something we have never seen before, a sitting U.S. president attending oral arguments.
We watched him leave here from the White House just a short time ago and motorcade over to the Supreme Court, which is just a few minutes away.
Trump walked into a grand courtroom in Washington, D.C. and took a seat in the first row of the public docks. The case was birthright citizenship, the right of anyone born on U.S. soil to become a U.S. citizen. As the plaintiff laid out,
ask an American what our citizenship rule is, and they'll tell you. Everyone born here is a citizen alike.
Finally, this week, the verdict returned, and it went against him.
The U.S. Supreme Court has struck down President Trump's executive order ending automatic U.S. citizenship for any baby born in the country.
But it hasn't all been bad news for the president by any means.
The High Court did hand Trump one big win Monday, expanding presidential power, allowing him to fire officials from independent bipartisan regulatory agencies for any reason.
The Supreme Court has ruled that transgender student athletes can be banned from participating in girls' sports.
The court struck down limits on the amounts of money that political parties can spend. The Trump administration argued in favor of getting rid of the caps on spending.
Bearing in mind that in his first term, Trump appointed 3 of the 9 judges on the court, is that hiring round now paying off? Or does the Supreme Court still have just enough independence? And what does all of this mean for the balance of power in America? The story today, Trump versus the Supreme Court.
So we've been coming to the end of this term, and as a result, there's been this flurry of decisions, and they drop at 10 a.m. on weekdays. So there's been kind of a lot of anticipation building, particularly towards a few big rulings.
As Washington correspondent at The Times, George Grylls has been on Supreme Court watch, waiting for the latest rulings to drop.
To be honest, everyone was waiting for this birthright ruling. That was seen as the most consequential, and they left the best till last. This was a big case, and therefore it was the final decision before they went on their summer break.
They know how to grab everyone's attention. We'll talk about some of those cases and some of those decisions in depth in a moment. Before we do, just take us right back to the basics. Give us a quick bluffer's guide to the composition of the Supreme Court at the moment. Who are the justices that hold the American system to account?
So the Supreme Court is one of 3 branches of US government. You've got the executive branch, which is the president, and you've got Congress, so that's the 2 houses on Capitol Hill. That's the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then the third is the Supreme Court. And the American system is designed where you've basically got this kind of triangle of government that is kind of controlling the US. Historically, it's kind of rare for one party to control all the levers of power at once. But that's the situation we have right now. Now, that may change come the midterms in November. But as of, July 2026, we have the president in President Trump. On the right, a Republican president. Then we have both houses on Capitol Hill, both houses of Congress are controlled by the Republicans. And then you have the Supreme Court, which has a 6-3 conservative majority. So there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. 6 of them were appointed by Republican presidents and 3 were appointed by Democratic presidents. And that means that, one of the most common results in judgments that are passed down by the Supreme Court is 6-3, basically reflecting that kind of ideological divide.
Yeah. And given that composition, given that it is heavily weighted towards the conservative Republican end of the spectrum, does that mean court judgments always go Trump's way?
Well, that's the surprising thing, because you might have, and I think certainly Trump himself expected the court to be much more compliant, but he's struggling to get the justices, including some whom he nominated himself. 3 of those 6 conservative justices were appointed by Trump to be kind of unfailingly loyal, just to follow exactly what he wants them to do. The court doesn't always go Trump's way. So, for example, it struck down his use of emergency powers to pass sweeping tariffs. But on the other hand, quite often it does support his agenda. So, for example, most famously, perhaps listeners will remember the overturning of Roe versus Wade and therefore ending women's federal right to an abortion.
You mentioned earlier the birthright decision. That is the biggie. It was the one everyone was waiting for. Just take us back to that case. What exactly is birthright citizenship? What was at stake?
So if you are born in the US, you are currently an American citizen. This is a quite unique approach to citizenship that America takes, and it's certainly different to that in Western Europe or in Australia, New Zealand, other parts of the Western world. But the US and quite a few other countries in America apply this rule of jus solis, which is the Latin phrase which means kind of rights of the soil, as opposed to jus sanguinis, which is rights of the blood. So as long as you were born in the US, that means that you are an American citizen. Now, there are currently an estimated 14 million undocumented migrants in the US. The highest concentrations are in California and Texas and Florida. For Trump, who campaigned in 2024 very strongly on lowering immigration and imposing a lot of new security measures on the southern border, for him, cracking down on birthright citizenship was extremely important. So within hours of becoming president, again in January 2025, he returned to the White House and he signs an executive order and he says, no, we're getting rid of birthright citizenship. And his argument was that basically this was passed at a time when there wasn't a lot of migration. And nowadays he claimed that the law was being abused. Specifically, he said it was about rich Chinese businessmen who would kind of fly over, when their wives were pregnant, they would fly their wives over and they would have their babies in the US. And that was a way of gaining US citizenship. I think in reality, it was about these 14 million undocumented migrants, many of whom come from Latin America, and what was the citizenship status of their children, because also once their children become citizens, there is an easier path towards a green card and kind of settled status for their parents in due course as well. So that's what I think it was all about.
And this is clearly an issue that means a lot to Donald Trump. He turned up in court when this was being discussed. He's tweeted about it a lot. He often takes to his phone and social media to express his opinion on this. It was the one everyone was waiting for. Just talk us through the ruling.
So the ruling, it depends on how you kind of break it down, but either it was 6-3 or 5-4 rejecting the president and saying you can't do this by executive order. So the reason is that the birthright citizenship is enshrined in the Constitution. It's from the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So you're talking about laws that have been in the US Constitution for 150 years. The Constitution is not something simply that a president can change by executive order. And this was basically the ruling of the justices. They were saying you can't just do this as one man elected president and steamroller it through.
So they've decided to uphold the Constitution. Just talk us through the numbers. You mentioned earlier that it was either 6-3 or 5-4. What's the disparity?
Certainly, in terms of who rejected Trump, you could say it was 6-3. But one of the conservative justices, Brett Kavanaugh, basically kind of agreed with the majority of the court in most of its opinion, but dissented on the question of whether or not the Constitution could be amended and how. And he was saying, well, actually, Trump, you can go for it if you just go through Congress, which to many legal experts was a bit of a bizarre ruling, to be honest, because they think that even if it did go through Congress, it would inevitably end up back at the Supreme Court.
So that's a legal fail for Donald Trump, but it hasn't all been bad news for him and his agenda on immigration. Talk us through some of the decisions that have gone his way on that subject.
No, it's a bit of a mixed bag. So there was another ruling as part of this kind of end of term judgments coming out that was about the status of Haitian and Syrian immigrants and whether they enjoyed protections, basically, from deportation. And the court sided with Trump and said, no, they didn't. And then there was another case that was important for the Republicans ahead of November's midterms on campaign financing. So the Republicans tend to raise more money than the Democrats. They've already amassed a war chest of almost $1 billion to fight the midterms, but there were restrictions on how they could use that money. And the Supreme Court lifted those restrictions and basically said, it's a free-for-all, go for it. So yeah, since Trump returned to the White House, the Supreme Court have kind of had a mixed bag. On some occasions, it sided with Trump, but I would say on the really big cases that relate to his agenda overall, one, birthright, two, tariffs and his use of emergency powers to pass sweeping tariffs. You'll remember last year when he got out the kind of board with all the various countries, including a penguin colony in the middle of nowhere with no inhabitants, and imposed tariffs on them.
That was quite the moment.
That was quite the moment. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't just randomly use emergency powers to impose these tariffs. So those were two kind of massive parts of Trump's agenda where the Supreme Court said, no, you don't have total authority to kind of do whatever you like.
George, you've been talking us through some of the recent raft of decisions from the Supreme Court. One that certainly grabbed headlines was the decision on trans athletes. Just remind us of the case that was being discussed. What was the decision they were having to make?
So there were two instances, one in Idaho and one in West Virginia, where universities and schools had excluded trans athletes from competing in women's sports. And this was challenged by the kind of trans athletes and their families. The case made its way all up to the Supreme Court. And the question was, can schools and universities exclude trans athletes on the basis of their gender identity? And the Supreme Court basically said, yes, they can. What is interesting is that this is a question of can they? It seems likely that as this debate kind of goes on, it will turn into a question of should they.
So they've ruled that it is possible for universities to do that, but they haven't decided that that's inevitable.
That's right.
So that might be another round of that to come. Why is that decision seen as such a big win for Donald Trump in particular?
Well, throughout the 2024 election campaign, he made that, a cornerstone of his campaign. And he, one of the really kind of the campaign slogans that really cut through during the 2024 election was Kamala Harris is for they, them, and President Trump is for you. The Republicans were trying to illustrate how the Democrats were kind of more interested in identity questions than, for example, the economy. The consequences of the end of the coronavirus pandemic and the war in Ukraine led to massive inflation. And yet the Democrats seem to be kind of arguing among themselves about identity. So this kind of question of whether trans athletes can play in women's sports, it affects such a tiny number of people. But it took on this kind of outsized importance within American electoral politics. And Trump had kind of really campaigned against trans athletes competing against women, saying it was unfair.
And we will, of course, keep men out of women's sports, I promise. Last year, the radical left's gender insanity arrived right here in Salem when a man was allowed to transfer onto the Roanoke College women's swim team. And I just met them backstage, the great swimmers. I didn't notice a male on that particular team. I didn't notice a male on that team.
And so he celebrated this victory at the Supreme Court. And like I say, I think we could see further cases test this further.
So far we've got a big win for the American Constitution, a few wins for Donald Trump, which are quite political. Now let's look at some of the decisions that have come through that could actually change the way power works in America and change presidential powers for a very long time. One of the very big decisions that everybody was waiting for was on the subject of whether the president could fire the head of certain organizations. Tell us about that case.
Yes, this was a very important case that was about whether or not the president has the right to fire the heads of independent regulators without much reason, basically on a whim.
What are the regulatory bodies that will be affected?
So the regulatory bodies, there's what we would call quangos, basically, and they basically hold to account in an independent fashion parts of government, businesses. They can investigate crime, but they're an extra kind of check and balance on power. So these are agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. These are the sorts of agencies we're talking about.
So these are really important regulatory bodies and agencies that are supposed to operate independently for the system to work. And they now have a direct line to the president because the president can decide to fire the head of the agencies without needing to explain his reasons, without having to go through any kind of process, just on a whim.
Yeah, and the Supreme Court came to a pretty kind of confusing ruling. So basically, they said, yes, he can. He can fire the heads of independent agencies, but they introduced a carve-out for the Fed, which is the Federal Reserve. It operates like the Bank of England in the UK, so it sets interest rates. And they basically said Trump can't just fire the head of the Fed. This goes back to Trump has basically been putting pressure on the Fed to lower interest rates because that would mean people would have to pay less towards their mortgage. It would bring down the cost of living for a lot of his voters. But the Fed is been reluctant to do so because they see that inflation is still high. And in fact, it's been rising as a result of the war in Iran. The system is specifically designed to kind of resist political interference for precisely this reason. It's tempting for the president to kind of lean on them to say, please lower interest rates. We got an election coming up and, this will help a lot of my voters. The independence of the Fed is important, therefore, in terms of America's economic credibility to tell the markets, no, we don't just operate on a whim, by presidents kind of demanding stuff for the election. There's something more that's underpinning it. The Supreme Court kind of agreed with that principle. So they offered Trump a partial win where they said, yeah, you could fire everyone else from all these other regulatory bodies, but not when it comes to the Fed.
And they didn't think those other bodies mattered as much?
I mean,
What's the difference?
I can't explain their thinking, except they presumably thought that, it would impact America's economic credibility if Trump was able to kind of shape the composition of the Fed's board, which sets interest rates.
What was the explanation of the decision around all of this that came down? Which way did the justices go and how many of them? Give us the breakdown.
So the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that Trump could not immediately fire Lisa Cook, who's the Federal Reserve governor, and then on a separate case, because they split them into two, on whether he could fire the heads of all the other kind of federal agencies, it was 6-3 and divided along partisan lines.
So when it came to the credibility of the economy, a couple of the Conservatives did go over, but otherwise very much down party lines. Does this shift, the checks and balances that keep the American system honest, if suddenly independent agencies are now able to be controlled from the White House? Is that a major shift in the way America works?
It removes another layer of accountability from the American system, certainly. It's part of this slow politicization of the kind of remaining independent agencies that exist in the US to kind of buttress against, autocracy, effectively. I mean, you look at the kind of mergers and takeovers, things that could have been investigated and probably would have been under a previous administration that have gone under the radar, and they've basically wiped their hands of it and say, go ahead. You would have to say that it's already changed, that this is Trump in his pomp, that he has total power over DC. But at the same time, you could argue that if there was a moment when Trump exerted his maximum power, when he had control of all the levers of power and could kind of become some sort of autocrat, that moment has probably passed. It was now, and it's probably passed, because if you look at the polling for the midterms, he looks very likely to lose the House of Representatives. On a bad night, he could lose the Senate. And suddenly those three levers of power that I talked about at the beginning, maybe the Republicans only have two rather than all three. And the fact that the Supreme Court has not allowed him just to pass everything through executive order shows that there are checks and balances still within the US system.
That was George Grylls, Washington correspondent at The Times. The producers today were Olivia Case and Micaela Arneson. The executive producer was Taryn Siegel. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.